So now we'll move on to the next presentation. We'll talk about planning issues. I would like to introduce reset urbanization, global sprawl, climate change, and equity. Peter is a longtime colleague of mine. We go back to the old solar days in the 1970s. So I've known Peter forever. He is a planner, had his own firm, Calthorpe and Associates, for years, does very large scale planning work, now works with HDR, so it's HDR Calthorpe. They are doing master planning and planning projects all over the world. He will show you some projects in China and Ho Chi Minh City, for example. He will talk about global sprawl, climate change, and equity issues. Peter has is just you'll see he's an incredible human being and very, very knowledgeable on how to get a handle on global sprawl and how we can plan sustainably. So we'll turn it over now to Peter.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, it's been a long road so far.
Perfect.
So I want to expand a little bit beyond just carbon and climate change, because I think it's actually easier to solve many problems simultaneously as opposed to solving one thing one step at a time. And cities are where all of the well-being of mankind come into focus. It's also where the greatest challenges of mankind surface. And when you have the opportunity to deal with housing and affordability and racism and segregation and poverty and inequality, at the same time that you're solving for climate change, on some level, I think you actually have an easier path to go through. We know cities are where the future of the globe is going. And it's because, for a lot of good reasons, they're centers of innovation. They're where the population rates begin to decline as people move from countryside to cities. They have greater economic opportunity. They have greater health opportunity. All sorts of positive things happen. And we know that cities are the lower carbon way of living. You know, this is a famous quote by Winston Churchill, and I think that Ed always focuses on buildings. I think the right term here is that we shape cities and thereafter they shape us. As we segregate by income or race or ethnicity and other things, we begin to shape the social life that we lead and the set of opportunities that everybody has. In a way, cities are these nested phenomena. We can deal with ecosystem issues, we can deal with housing issues, we can deal with energy, we can deal with transportation. And in a way, they always get connected by how we shape our cities. They're the underlying architecture of our demands, and therefore they are where we need to start if we want to be, we want to produce less carbon, use less land, and create healthier communities. I think that we're battling global sprawl. Sprawl is the enemy, whether it comes in different forms around the planet. There's low-income sprawl in most of the global south, where the poor are isolated in the periphery, away from jobs, away from economic activity, away from the social nexus that makes opportunities materialize. They are a plague on the planet right now, and they are expanding at massive rates. We have our own version in the global north, where we're wealthy. We still sprawl, and it has the same attributes. Lots of energy, lots of land, lots of social isolation in all cases. In Asia, especially in China, they've evolved a special kind of sprawl, high density sprawl, where the buildings are tall and big, and yet they're spread out in ways that don't allow people to connect and integrate, don't allow people to walk and bike, don't allow the environment to be enhanced. So I'm going to deal with each one of these typologies, global typologies of different forms of sprawl. In China, the history after the has been very much centered on the modernist notion: towers in the parks, massive new road systems, isolation of uses, urban landscape designed around cars and freeways and mass production. It's a placeless environment that I think the country itself is now beginning to shift away from. It went from a country where people were pedestrians and bikes to now congestion. I think Beijing is on its 7th or 8th ring road. The more roads you build, the less you solve the problem. This is inside of a super block in Kunming. This is an environment not designed for the pedestrian. There's no ground floor shops. There's no sidewalks. There are very few local destinations. This is an environment designed to force people into automobiles. As a matter of fact, this is a map, a SketchUp diagram of the super blocks that are typically developed now, 500 meters per side. And when streets are that infrequent, they have to be larger and larger. And the larger they become, the less hospitable they are to pedestrians. And without pedestrian mobility, of course, you really lose, the city breaks down. That exact same amount of streets and buildings can be reconfigured into something that looks like this. What's astounding is you can make the same investment and have a completely different outcome, which is amazing. You know, this configuration of small city blocks, varied buildings, mixed uses, pedestrian-friendly sidewalks, this is what great cities have always been made from. And the moment you do that, you begin to conserve energy and reduce carbon emissions. So let me give you some examples of how we went through a new process in China. This is the city of Kunming. It's a province of 30 million. The historic section is to the south. And the large growth area to the north, study area, was laid out rather than around freeways, was laid out around transit and transit-oriented development. So one always starts with the natural environment, understanding where the ecology, how the ecology moves through a site, where open space and natural features need to be preserved. And so the first step is always is preservation. The next step is, of course, recognizing what's already built. And that's a reality on the ground. There are roads. There's always a road network that has to be there. But once you get that in place, you realize that there are these areas that can be contiguous and continuous for the pedestrian and the biker and for transit. Overlaying transit and looking at the walk sheds around the station areas is the next step. So this is a step-by-step planning methodology that lets us arrive at a more humane built environment for the city, and of course, a greatly reduced environmental and carbon footprint. This one area within this larger zone, and this is an area for 4 million people, we planned in greater detail, bringing human scale and diversity back into the community, mixed use and walkability, and a focus, of course, on the transit stop as the organizing feature of this community. The before and after plans are pretty stunningly different. In one case, all the housing is to one side, separated from the jobs, and it's all built around super blocks. In the other one, human scale city blocks that preserve the riparian corridors and open space features and the riverfront as open space, but also these greenways that are auto-free streets that allow pedestrians and bikers to move comfortably through their community without having to confront cars. This idea that the open space network, the environment, comes first, is a really important formative element in how to shape cities to really foster human well-being. And so this combination of factors is what we need to design cities around. This is a shot of what I think makes a lot of sense in China, which is auto-free streets. You know, in China, there's only about 30% of the population who owns vehicles, automobiles. So why should 100% of the streets be given over to cars? Why not have places where the pedestrian, the biker, and transit move comfortably and freely? Those being the heart of mobility in the city, and of course, the solution for low carbon future. The setbacks along the river means that the environment is preserved, water quality. All these elements fit together. I think solving for climate change should never be thought of as an isolated effort. It's actually within a larger context of respecting the society, the culture, and the environment at large. So here you see these no super blocks, but more human scale blocks, which then give birth to smaller, more intimate streets, which give birth to a sense of neighborhood and placemaking that we seem to have lost in many parts of the world. Now, the low-income sprawl is almost a bigger challenge. And right now, we're working in Ho Chi Minh City, looking at how the growth of a city of 9 million can accommodate another 3 to 4 million people. And of course, the expansion of the city is massive and at high acceleration, and it is spreading out at very low densities throughout. But more tragically, it's spreading out into the floodplain. The cheap land is the lowland. The low-income population ends up in the floodplain where they're most vulnerable to lose everything. The different orange colors here represents the amount of development within the existing floodplain that's already built, and then the new master plan growth, each around 400 to 500, 600 square kilometers of vulnerability being built into the future of the city. So I think that we need to think through the results of climate change as we also think about how to reduce our carbon emissions. How can we shape our cities and our buildings in ways that allow us to live through this transition? The most fundamental choice is the hardest one, which is to no longer build in the floodplain. Cities need to begin migrating up to high ground. It's inevitable that it needs to happen. It can be done in an orderly or chaotic manner. The various policies, just as Ed enumerated policies around energy and carbon emissions, I think we need to have policies around how we build cities and where we build cities at this point. So we've identified locations around Ho Chi Minh City where the new growth can happen on high ground. And there's plenty of space for the next generation of growth to happen. It needs a different orientation in terms of infrastructure, highways and metro lines and other kinds of infrastructure, but the possibility is there. There needs to be a total rethinking of our transport system. We tend to think about buildings as energy consumers, but of course cars and trucks are the biggest. And it turns out, interestingly enough, that the motorcycle, which is what is used ubiquitously in this part of the world, if it's electrified, becomes the most efficient form of mobility known to mankind. In a way, I've been a transit advocate for so many decades that you can lose sight of what's right in front of you, which is that these buses that run on a schedule sometimes run empty, sometimes are returning against the flow of the commute. The occupancy levels mean that they actually lose their efficiency. Electrified motorcycles can become the most efficient form of transit. They're always 100% occupied. Very hard to see a motorcycle running along with nobody on it. But the problem, of course, is where is this physical space for them? In the same way that we have to build private right-of-ways for trains and buses in the form of BRT, I think for places like Vietnam, we can build private right-of-ways for electric motorcycles. Therein enhance mobility and also create an incentive for people to transition. In a way, when Ed says the first step for all buildings is to electrify, I think the same is true for mobility. So what happens? It's interesting. Everybody loves pedestrians and cyclists. And of course, in a simple lane, dedicating a lane to pedestrians will move maybe 19,000 people, or cyclists 14,000. And of course, transit, the same space moves a lot more people. But actually, nobody did the calculation for motorcycles. Motorcycles, e-bikes with 1.5 passengers, which is the norm there, actually does better than light rail and BRT. So it's cheaper to build a lane for e-bikes than it is for light rail or BRT, and it's a lot less expensive to maintain and operate. So these are radical ways of thinking about how we shape the city. Well, if we're going to shape the city around the e-bikes, then we ought to create a road network that supports it. Now, road networks always have to be complex and hierarchical, but the most interesting thing that we're thinking about now is these auto-free streets that are dedicated to e-bikes. If you make that form of mobility the most efficient and has to confront the least congestion, that's how people will move around. And of course, they can become the most efficient form of transit ever known to mankind. So I think that I don't think this is the answer for the whole planet. I think that each place has its own unique social ecology, economic ecology, and cultural ecology. The culture in Vietnam is motorcycles, and the solution may be to build places for those to transition to e-bikes. That's one thought. Another one, of course, is the ecological systems and the heat island effect. As we watch the city grow over time, you can see the population expansion in the three maps above. You have a heat island effect, which I believe is going to be talked to later, that traces it. As we build cities without trees and without shade and without canopies in these hot, wet climates, we exacerbate the impact of heat island, which of course is debilitating to human health, as well, of course, to the energy demands of the buildings within them. And so preserving the open lands and the agricultural lands nearby, and the simple act of creating parks with trees. I remember many years ago that I discovered one of the hotter cities in California, Sacramento, in the Central Valley. The downtown with its shade trees was on average 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding suburban areas that didn't develop the parklands and the tree canopy. So these are some very simple and profound, I think, solutions. Easy to do, plant a tree in the city, make sure that streets are small and walkable and bikeable and lined with trees. We need to build complete neighborhoods. The idea that we isolate the poor in informal settlements at the periphery, as opposed to integrating them into the center of the city and or the new growth areas with a range of incomes and housing types, is really important. So what does it look like on the ground? This is a piece of high ground near Ho Chi Minh City. And once again, it starts, as in that example in China, with an open space network that deals with drainage and detention and recreation space and preservation of the natural ecology. The road network has to be fine-grained, human scale, walkable. A network of auto-free streets can be overlaid so that people can move around in different ways, freely and easily. Neighborhood centers that are close by, always within walking distance. So schools and shops and services are easily at hand. It's a simple planning methodology that can work very easily. And then, of course, mass transit, the metro system expanding into this area, and the BRT system augmenting the e-bikes. And layering in local jobs so that there isn't a long commute for everybody, so that there's a balance between jobs and housing at a sub-regional manner. These are the kind of techniques one would use, just as Ed lists a whole series of techniques for buildings. We have really good techniques that we understand and can easily accomplish at cities. Well, what about the global north, where we're addicted to cars and sprawl, subdivisions, office parks, and malls? First is to understand that it's not all the same. In the Bay Area where I live, the difference between these three places, one in the suburban area shaped 100% around cars, where every use is isolated, has a very different performance from old historic neighborhood that grew up around streetcars, and is mixed use with walkable streets and local destinations. And of course, there's the city. Those three typologies result in remarkably different outcomes. In terms of carbon, today, the per capita is around 6 metric tons in the city, and it's 21 metric tons per capita in the outer suburbs. There's a 3.5 to 1 difference there, just given the shape of the urban environment. Land consumption, household travel, which of course is not only an energy and carbon issue, it's a household cost issue. This now runs easily 25% of household costs are going to transportation. The walk score and property values. We built futures for the state of California, looking at how the next 10 million people would arrive and what kind of communities. And so we created a hypothetical future in which more than half of the population went into that mid-density, compact, walkable community, as opposed to the standard 70% going into sprawl and auto-oriented. And the differences are astounding. Once again, this is before you begin to apply all the technology, all the renewables, all the energy conservation in buildings. Just by changing the way we shape our cities, we save tremendous amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. Vehicle miles traveled per capita goes way down, which is, as I said, a savings to those households that are really economically pressed these days. If you map how many miles per household people travel, you can see the profound differences. And once again, if you're stranded at the periphery, you're obligated to travel great distances. And those distances amount to environmental degradation and a loss of community and time for so many working people. The building energy goes down the more compact the buildings are. I used to say a party wall was more effective than a solar wall. I'm not sure that's still the case, but the idea is that if we create inefficient envelopes, we have to go just that much farther to solving the problem with renewables. All that travel results in health costs, respiratory, and also cardiac. The less walking people do, the less healthy they are. The more foul the air, the less healthy they are, the more we spend on healthcare. So all these things cascade and intermingle. And the good news is, solving for one, we can solve for many. So here's a map of Los Angeles activity-related health indicators. The red areas where people are sedentary, and the blue and green are where people walk. Walking, just like a tree, Walking is the most simple, healthy human enterprise. It's good for the environment, it's good for your social life, and it's good for your personal health. Infrastructure costs go down. So actually, it turns out that it's much cheaper to build environments that are environmentally, socially, and economically coherent. The annual household cost. Now, this is a big one. What we watch in the United States, some of the upper income parts of the globe, is huge economic stress for the working class. And it has a lot to do with the kind of physical environment that they're trying to maintain. That single family dwelling on a cul-de-sac, 30 miles or and farther out into the suburbs, is an economic burden that actually drives the well-being of those households down. And then, of course, land consumption. If you care about open space, if you care about agriculture, if you care about habitat and ecology, you have to care about a smaller urban footprint. So all these issues converge. This is what LA looks like under a sprawl future in the state of California. And this is the same population in a more compact, transit-oriented and walkable configuration. So these are big choices that set the stage for how we solve our housing crisis and our energy crisis and our carbon crisis. I'm going to take a quick detour here because this is quite personal to me now. How do we solve the housing crisis that we're beginning to recognize in North America? We have huge housing deficits. We had the old pattern, which was just keep driving until you could afford to buy a house. And that collapsed in 2008. It turns out we have a reservoir of adjacent and abundant land. It's called the Strip. The Strip is where we can infill and create diversity and walkability in our communities. So once again, it's about renewal and redevelopment. This is a classic suburban strip. This is what it could become. The land is there and the economic need is there for this type of housing. As you build densities in these ribbons, you can create more businesses, you can create bikeways, you can create transit. We actually did the numbers for the Bay Area. We looked at all the strip commercial land, and it added up to around 15,000 acres, or around 1.4 million new units of housing. Most of it right in the heart of Silicon Valley, where people want to be in terms of jobs. It sits on right-of-ways that are big enough to handle the next generation of transit. And I think the next generation of transit, and so when you look at the environmental impact of building on these ribbons, the grand boulevards, I call them, as opposed to more sprawl, the water use, the energy use, the amount of driving, the greenhouse gas emissions, the household costs, they're all on the order of magnitude less. They're more affordable to the environment and they're more affordable to the household. So what happens on this strip? Bus rapid transit, of course, is one of the most efficient types of transit, and there's space for that. There's a new generation of transit coming. In China right now, they have autonomous rapid transit buses. This is a new technology that I think is going to revolutionize how we move. Even more are smaller autonomous rapid transit vans. If you give these vehicles private right-of-ways, they become almost as efficient as those electric bikes in Vietnam. So here's El Camino, one of the biggest central strips in Silicon Valley, one of the wealthiest places on the planet. It doesn't look very good, but it's big enough to build this. Sidewalk cafes, bikeways, still room for cars, and right-of-ways dedicated to transit. That's the same dimension. And then I believe the next generation will be these smaller autonomous vans in dedicated right-of-ways where they can really move efficiently And you can cluster origins and destinations in a way that allows people to basically have 1 or 2 stop trips from start to finish. So to conclude, I'll just say, ironically, you don't want to have a sense that you can make everything the same across the planet. But there are these design principles that I think are universal, and you can measure them. You can actually put standards to them. One is to preserve the natural ecology, the agrarian landscapes, and the cultural heritage. Another one is mixed use. It's a universal trait of a great city. A third is a fine-grained, human-scale circulation network, something that allows the pedestrian and bike to move comfortably and safely. Fourth is the amount of public space we put within easy reach of everybody in the city, walking distance to parks and schools, shops, and civic spaces. Making space for the pedestrian and the bike is central to a healthy city. Enhancing and expanding transit in the various ways that I think are coming our way, the next generation of transit, I call it. And the idea that we would shape the city around our transit networks, use the underutilized strip commercial land and redevelop in ways that make the city more complete and more hospitable. So I'm going to conclude there. I don't know how long I've gone. But I do want you to see this as a whole systems approach, and that actually solving for climate change and solving for carbon emissions gives us the opportunity to solve a lot of other problems simultaneously. So I'll end there.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And we're right at the end of our allotted time. So with that, everyone, we're going to take a 7-minute break, and we'll be right back on the same Zoom line. So we're going to take a 7-minute break, and then we'll be back for the Reset Practice and Policy Professionals and Organizations Making Big Moves session. So stay tuned.